Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, regrettably, I was not entirely present when the Minister of Finance introduced the resolution, so I only heard part of his contribution. I intend, Mr. Speaker, to ask a simple question, and that is whether we needed this resolution at all, and whether, in fact, the resolution satisfies the requirements of the Constitution and therefore should be allowed. You will therefore forgive me, Mr. Speaker, if I retrace some of the ground covered by the member for Labrie, Auger, but I think it is absolutely imperative. I regret I don't have with me this morning, Mr. Speaker, the Hansard report of the meeting that took place to secure the passage of the Public Finance Management Act. I was hoping to have it to make references to some comments which I had made about some provisions of that act, and I think the anxieties that I expressed then perhaps have come to the forefront given what we are now faced with. I, for one, will never ever engage in blaming the government for introducing late estimates, meaning beyond the financial year. I wouldn't do that. I've been a Minister of Finance for several years, and I readily concede that far more often than not, estimates of expenditure were introduced past the close of the financial year, that is to say, March 31st. But they have always been introduced in accordance with the requirements of the Constitution. And that is that they're introduced within the next 30 days as required by the Constitution. So as a former Minister of Finance, I understand full well where there's going to be delay in the presentation of estimates of revenue and expenditure. I understand that these things will happen, and they can be shaped by numerous events. And I think even the constitutional framers understood that. That is why they allowed for some latitude between the close of the financial year and a subsequent period. What the Constitution never did was to specify what constitutes the financial year. Never ever did so. It never stated that the financial year would be March 31st. And in its wisdom, the reason was very simple, Mr. Speaker, because the financial year could change. I mean, there are some countries in the Caribbean whose financial year ends on December 31st the previous year. And certainly, when we served in the government of St. Lucia, we actually toyed with the idea of returning to a calendar year, meaning close the financial year on December 31st, as happens in some other jurisdictions. Of course, there's reference to other statutes that speak of the financial year closing in March 31st. And this Public Finance Management Act went on, however, to stipulate what the financial year was. And it said in the definition of financial year under, I believe it is Section 1 of the Act, the definition section 2 rather, it says financial year means a period of 12 months ending on the 31st day of March in a year. In effect, therefore, Mr. Speaker, the Act did not make a difference to accustomed practice, which is that the financial year ends on March 31st of the year in question. But I want to preface my comments by making two references, Mr. Speaker. The first, I believe it is crucial because much has been made of it. I am particularly focused on that section of the resolution that refers to the declaration of a state of emergency by the Governor General as approved by Parliament and gazetted. And want, however, to make the point, Mr. Speaker, that there seems to be a prevailing view in the legal offices of the government of St. Lucia, or the people who give advice to the government of St. Lucia. I mean, I'm not even going to say the Attorney General's office, but a prevailing view that somehow, when you declare a state of emergency under Section 17, you are empowered to change or alter other laws. And so, while I will not engage in any exegesis on COVID laws and state of emergency laws, but I want to make the very simple point that no state of emergency allows a government to alter any other law in a constitution or elsewhere with impunity. Because Section 17 that is often quoted is very clear, Mr. Speaker. It says, the Governor General may, by proclamation which shall be published in the official gazette, declare that a state of emergency exists for the purposes of this chapter. That's what it does. It allows the executive to interfere with Chapter 1 of the Constitution that deals with fundamental rights and freedoms. But not even that power to deal with fundamental rights and freedoms allow the Governor General to act with impunity. Because whatever enactment that is proposed by the executive, including the Governor General, has to pass a litmus test. And the litmus test is it reasonably justifiable in a democratic society? That's the litmus test. Now, Mr. Speaker, you will notice, or you may recall, that I did not attend Parliament when the first COVID legislation was enacted. I'll confess to you why I did not attend. I did not attend because there were provisions in that first piece of COVID legislation that were clearly unconstitutional. But I felt that there were overriding interests concerned, and because of the peculiar nature of the circumstances that existed, it then became necessary to ensure that some kind of framework was in place to deal with the issues that confronted us. I didn't feel it was necessary to put any barrier or to raise any indelicate questions or indelicate issues. But to the credit of the Attorney General's Department, Mr. Speaker, subsequent legislation attempted to deal with some of this because it was recognized that that legislation was excessive and had gone beyond permissible limits authorized by the Constitution of the country. So in addressing this issue of whether you're going to seek an extension of the financial year to introduce estimates of expenditure, the fact that a state of emergency exists really is of little moment of little consequence, because any act by the Governor General under Section 17 don't allow him to interfere with any other provision of this Constitution outside of the fundamental rights and freedoms. It doesn't. The organs of state continue. These provisions continue. That is why this Constitution has a twofold approach to deal with transgressions. It gives an aggrieved litigant the right under the Bill of Rights separately to contest any actions of the executive for an infringement of the Bill of Rights, but it gives you a separate section to deal with any infringements of the Constitution outside of the Bill of Rights. So this notion that somehow, because you call a state of emergency, you have unlimited power to interfere, and I'm not suggesting that that is our fundamental issue today. I'm just making the point that it is erroneous logic that you can interfere with other provisions of the Constitution. That's clearly wrong. Now, Mr. Speaker, that being said, let us come to two other paragraphs in the resolution. The question is, did the government need to do this? Did they have to invoke Section 32, I think it is, of this Public Finance Management Act at all? Did they have to? Was it necessary to do so? And was it even necessary to do so by this resolution? Mr. Speaker, I'm from the old school, you know. I've been some years now. Age is catching up, you know, Mr. Speaker. And even now, as I return to legal practice, I'm learning again. I mean, doing a refresher course for all practical purposes. What I do know is this: no act of Parliament can transgress the Constitution of the country. And a resolution that purports to aid an act of Parliament to do so, that resolution has to be struck down. And you know, Mr. Speaker, where you see the Constitution speaks and covers the ground, no legislation can come and cover the ground or alter the ground that the Constitution speaks to. Look at these paragraphs, Mr. Speaker. And let me read it for you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas it is provided under Section 32(4) of the Public Finance Management Act, and I warned that this act will be like a millstone around the neck of Parliament at one time, because you see, what the government has suffered is what previous governments have suffered, and we are not learning from each other. That's the part of the problem. The Minister of Finance does disclose that the World Bank insisted that they have this bill in place. So did the Caribbean Development Bank. They keep on ramming things down our throats because we want their money so badly. We can't tell them we're not accepting this. And what we do, we give away our sovereignty, do all kinds of things to please them, and then we are the ones, to use an inelegant word, we are the ones who are shafted at the end of the day. So what happens here? The World Bank insists that a legislation be introduced, and clearly there are provisions in that legislation that are unconstitutional. But leave that for another day. The time will come when it'll have to be tested. And this is where governments and opposition really have to have common purpose in these matters. And so when you see we sit on this side and we say, look, be careful and watch this, no matter what the differences may be between us, sharp as they may be, divisive as they may be sometimes, brutal as they may be, unkind as they may be, but there are things where the sovereignty of our country is concerned that we have to have a shared and common interest, because you're not going to be in office all the time. There's going to be a future. And what we end up doing, therefore, is just doing and enacting to their pleasure to satisfy them, and we then injure ourselves. I saw it with the company legislation, the foolishness that was passed as amendments to the Companies Act at the direction of the OECD. Utter nonsense, causing havoc among lawyers because of the stupidity of it. But instead of agreeing that this thing could be handled differently, we went along because we have an agenda. And I will tell you, of course, Mr. Speaker, I know full well, I know, because the other piece of legislation that came to the House, the public procurement legislation, I remember when that public procurement legislation came to the House, I had dialogue with the then leader of the opposition, who asked, I recall, for time because she was unhappy with some provisions. And I think the member for Castries Southeast was also present. And I said that we were under pressure. Why? Because, not us, the previous government had borrowed money from the Caribbean Development Bank. I think it was some 30 million, some structural adjustment loan. And a condition of that loan was that we passed this legislation, and we had not bothered with the legislation for years, Mr. Speaker, until we could not draw down, and they insist, if you want to draw down, you have to pass the legislation. And I was frank. I told a member for then, Michael South, that, look, this is a problem that we have. We need this to be able to draw down the legislation because the financial situation was difficult. And I said, all right. And that's when I said it. I said, all right, let us pass it, and then we will meet you if you have difficulties, discuss your difficulties, and then we would make adjustments. We did hold a meeting as she requested, but of course she indicated she had reviewed the legislation and she was comfortable with it. And these are the things we have to be very careful about, because these institutions do not often understand our constitutional environment and its requirements. Now, Mr. Speaker, look at the resolution. Whereas it is provided under Section 32(4) of the Public Finance Management Act number 14 of 2020, the Act, that if an emergency is declared in accordance with Section 17 of the Constitution of St. Lucia, and the minister is unable to lay the estimates before Parliament, he or she shall seek immediate approval of Parliament for an extension, with reasons for seeking the extension by a new date no later than 15 days before the end of the financial year. Now, you seek an extension no later than 15 days before the end of the financial year. As I said, Section 71, 79, Mr. Speaker, never defined a financial year. It was done in this Public Finance Management Act, as it is the responsibility of Parliament to do if it so wishes. But look at Section 79, Mr. Speaker. Look at what it says. It says, Mr. Speaker, the minister for the time being responsible for finance shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House before or not later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year estimates of the revenues and expenditures of St. Lucia for that financial year. In other words, Mr. Speaker, if the financial year ended on March 30th, the Constitution automatically gives you a further 30 days to April. Automatically. Why, therefore, do you need this at all? As a matter of fact, the Minister of Finance could have easily have come to this House and announced to the House that, look, there have been exigencies because we have been preoccupied with COVID. It's perfectly understandable. We have had issues. It is true that I have been criticized before for late estimates later. That's beside the point. And have relied on Section 79 of the Constitution solely and did not need this resolution or, for that matter, any reference to this ill-advised piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, the resolution goes on to say, and whereas it is further provided under Section 32(5) of the Act that where Parliament approves an extension of time under subsection 4, Parliament shall no later than 30 days after the end of the financial year approve the estimates and appropriation bill. You are an esteemed lawyer, Mr. Speaker, and you tell me, given the schedule that has been laid out here, whether the Constitution doesn't in fact take care of exactly what is being said here. Why therefore should I support this? You didn't need to do this. Because the very timetable specified in paragraphs 1 and paragraph 2 is fully satisfied under the requirements of Section 79 of the Constitution. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, that section 32 of that Public Finance Management Act really needs to be reviewed to make sure it is in absolute accord with Section 79 of the Constitution, although reference is made to it. This is really overkill, Mr. Speaker. Unnecessary overkilling. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, I'm sympathetic. I am. I don't have any difficulty in asking for an extension to lay the estimates of expenditure and bring it to the House. It has happened often in the past, as I said, Mr. Speaker. And the reasons that exist today are compelling reasons. Very, very compelling reasons. I mean, I've said before and I'll say it again, you know, it's not the start that matters, you know. Not the start, the commencement. It's the end of it. It's really the end. It's like a race, a marathon. It's not the start that matters. It's really how you finish, how you end. So too with the financial year. And make no mistake about it, whoever inherits this government in the next few months will have monumental challenges, incredible challenges. How you revive a country that is on its knees? How do you revive a country whose GDP has taken an extraordinary fall, a precipitous fall, especially a tourism and services dependent economy as ours? And that is enough reason to understand the torture that is going to be involved in preparing estimates of revenue and expenditure. But we can't be engaged in legislative exegesis that is unnecessary and unwanted. And when there are some in the society who argue that this is unconstitutional, given what the Constitution speaks to, it's not an argument to be lightly dismissed. It's a very serious argument. And so, Mr. Speaker, I hope that my position is very clear. I sympathize. I understand why you have to ask for an extension. You need not have come to Parliament to ask for it. Your Public Finance Management Act can't override the Constitution. Neither state of emergency can override the Constitution. The Governor General has no powers outside of Chapter 1 of the Constitution. And I accept that here it speaks to a reference. So the Constitution should have been allowed to speak, Mr. Speaker, and define the request of the Prime Minister. And under these circumstances, while I'm sympathetic and I support it, I cannot support the mechanism that is selected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.